If you prove to yourself that you can do hard things, that is portable to other areas of your life. I did the improv class so I can go do the triathlon. And one of them's mental, one of them's physical, but both are hard.
I do this task in my class where I get people 8 candidates for a kidney, and I randomly assign them to advocate for why one of the candidates should receive it. And one of the things that we show in this research is that whoever they advocate for all of a sudden shoots up the list in their mind. It's not strategic. It's not like I'm going to do this so I can benefit. They feel more attached to that person. But part of it is that when they think about how to persuade others, they're actually persuading themselves because they're coming up with evidence that's going to work. And in some ways, what they're doing is they're coming up with the evidence that also works for them. And I think it's the same thing with experience. In some ways, we're always, psychologists like to use these words sometimes, we're always both the object and the subject of our own attention. In some ways, we're observing ourselves doing the things that we're doing.
Adam, it is awesome to have you here on the Learning Leader Show. Welcome.
Thanks so much, Ryan. I'm so happy to be here.
What can we learn about leadership from Southwest Airlines Flight 1380?
That's a great question. So some of you may know Southwest Flight 1380. It was a flight that was going from New York LaGuardia to Dallas, Fort Worth, and about maybe half an hour into the flight, the pilots were flying along and they felt a jolt. And as the captain said, it felt like literally they'd been hit by a Mack truck in the middle of the air. And what had happened is their left engine had exploded and tore a hole in the side of the plane. And so, at that point, many different things were happening. First of all, one of the passengers was unfortunately fatally wounded by being sucked into that hole. Two, obviously, they were losing cabin pressure and oxygen, and so they had to adjust for that. Obviously, the hole in the side of the plane was also affecting the ability of the plane to fly. Clearly, they also lost one engine. And I think, what happened next is really just so remarkable because of how Tammy Jo Schultz, the pilot, handled that situation. And I think there's a few things that she did in that situation that I think are really critical. The first thing she did was clearly she diagnosed the problem. And they had a pretty good sense of what was going on. And so she figured out, okay, what do we need to do first? And the first thing that she realized is we need to lower as she described later on an interview, she said, the plane was telling us that it wanted to go down in altitude. So as she said, we let the plane go down in altitude. So she sort of figured out what the plane needed to do to be sort of effective. But here's what I think that made her not just a great pilot, but a great leader. Now imagine you're a passenger sitting in that plane and all of a sudden, there's a hole in the plane and now the plane is dropping. And there's probably this sense of just unbelievable sense of panic of, oh my God, we are just dropping from the sky to the ground. And she went on the loudspeaker and she just uttered 10 words. And when you talk to the passengers afterwards, they always describe those 10 words as transformational, like turning the possibility, a panic into possibility. And those 10 words were simply, we are not going down. We are going to Philly. And so she was letting them know, there was a plan. She didn't leave them in deafening silence, right? And that was really, really important. And I think one of the things that we forget as leaders is we got to accomplish the task. In this case, landing the plane successfully with no further injuries. But that doesn't mean we have to do that in a vacuum or isolation. Because we're a leader, because we have followers, we also have to communicate to those individuals. And so I think that is one of the remarkable things. And just her attention throughout the process. I love this one little detail. So she landed the plane and she purposely moved the plane so that the fire engines and ambulances were on the side where the engine exploded in case there was a fire, in case they knew anything. But she also, in her mind, she said, there could be a passenger who totally panics, rips open the exit door and goes out on the wing, just desperately trying to get out. So she actually turned the wings down so it would give people a little bit of a slide in case they sort of needed that. And then the last thing she did before she left the plane, and first of all, I should say she landed the plane successfully with no more injuries. And there's some remarkable little bits to that of how she was able to do that. When you listen to her, her, when you listen to her, talking to the air traffic controllers, um, she literally could be describing what she wants in her coffee that morning. She's so calm. Her voice is so steady. At one point, she says, "We've lost an engine. We have a hole in the plane, and it appears someone has gone out." And the air traffic controller was like, "Wait, someone went out. Okay, okay, wait, never mind. We'll deal with that later." But she's just so calm and cool and collected. And when she landed the plane, the EMTs came to check her out. It's the first thing they did, and one of them jokingly said to her, "How did you get through security?" And she's like, "Wait, what are you talking about?" And he said, "How did your nerves of steel not set off all the alarms at security? Like you're so calm. Like if you just measure your pulse, any other physiological reactivity, like there's someone who did not go through a crisis or a deal." And then the final thing she did before she left the plane, she went row by row and met with every passenger and just said, "How are you doing? Is there anything we can do?" There's a little girl. She's like, "This has never happened before. You're special. You got an experience no one else got." And so she just was very thoughtful. And then there's one final thing she did, which I think was really important, is she was black flying like 3 weeks later. And she said she did it partly for herself, right? She wanted to get back to the normalcy of everyday life, but she also did it because she wanted to show to other people that she wasn't afraid of flying. And if she's not afraid of flying, they shouldn't be afraid of flying either. And so she was that exemplar of like presenting herself the way that she wanted other people to be in the world. And I know that's
We
a
all
little bit of a long answer, but
It's
thanks for bearing
great.
with me.
It's a great way to open the book. And we all want to be that poised, calm. I come from the world of sports where I played quarterback, and like having moxie and being able to be cool under pressure when the D linemen are on top of you and stand in and make the throw is like a big part of it. And so you learn through like legitimate like fire. They're right on in your face. We want to be that. But for those who say, well, maybe she was just born that way. Maybe
Yeah,
that's just the way she is. Adam, like that's great. But how can I be like that? How can I
yeah.
be calm? How can I have my heart rate not rise when I'm landing a plane that literally blew up in the air? What are some ways to make this practical, like the practical application for maybe the more normal person, so they could implement some of the things they've learned from that flight, from that pilot into their own
Yeah.
lives?
Yeah. I'll say a couple of things about that. First of all, is I think that is literally the heart and the essence of the book Inspire, which is that leaders aren't born, they are made, right? And one of the things that I've shown in my research, 20 years of scientific research, right, is that there's a set of practical steps that we can take that over time will make us more inspiring and less infuriating to other people over time. And so one of the things, or one of those things, well, one of them is you know uh the more experience you have, the better off you are. There's a reason why rookie quarterbacks often, I'm going to use a phrase that's a little off color, but shit the bed, in their first year. Caleb Williams, right? Number one draft pick. Everyone said he's, revolutionary, and he's going to be defy the odds of the rookie quarterback. And there he is struggling just like every other rookie quarterback, in the NBA, even Peyton Manning, right? And so part of it is you need experience, right? But another thing, which I think is equally important, is that we need to reflect on our experiences and think about what happened. And we need to use those experiences to plan more effectively for the future, right? And so that's one of the things that like a quarterback can do. Like maybe they lose their how they use their footwork when they get under pressure. So they can practice their footwork so they know, okay, next time if my footwork's better, I'm going to handle that better. And so that's like a long-term strategy that people can use. Some of the short-term strategies that people can use, and I think this is, one of the most important ones of all, is I love speaking in front of really large crowds now. So put me in front of 500 people. I'm even happier if it's 1,000 people. I like that experience now. But like early on in my career, I, hated it, dreaded it, loathed it with an unmitigated sense of fear and passion. Like literally, I felt like I couldn't breathe. Like I couldn't even use my fingers. Like, how do I you go to the next slide if my hands are shaking? And I just felt so overwhelming. And this was around like 2006, 2007, so almost 10, 20 years ago. But in 2003, I actually introduced into the scientific literature a little essay. And the essay was simply, and we were trying to study the psychological effects of like sort of having a sense of power, status, control. And one of the things that we wanted to understand with the psychological effects is, well, Ryan, if I give you power and I put you in the role of the boss, you might act in certain ways just because I expect you to act that way. Or you maybe act that way is because you have more things on your mind and you're like your attention's divided, right? And so we want to know how is power actually coursing through your blood? Like, how is it really affecting you? And so my colleagues, Deb Grudenfeld, Joe McGee, and I actually settled. This was actually 1999. It didn't get published in 2003, but we ended up settling on this idea of what if we just ask people to recall experiences from their own life in which they felt powerful, in control, or their best self, right? And then what they can do is they can leverage that authentic experience to do that. And that's essentially, I basically used my own scientifically validated intervention, on myself. And I started to think about I know what I'm doing. I've done this before. I can think about the times where I did it really well. I can see myself performing well. And I could feel that confidence literally, take the anxiety and push it away. And instead of cortisol, I had sort of positive adrenaline and excitement. And I think that's, one of the ways that we can do that. So we can get into the right mindset. So like, before a Super Bowl, right? A quarterback might think about, how well they performed in the AFC championship game, right? As a way to get them, that. I'll tell you my favorite quarterback right now in the world is Josh Allen. And Josh Allen, was not good under pressure when he was a rookie, and he's, I think, one of the best demonstrations of someone who really learned over time how to be a better quarterback. And like people were talking, I mean, even in his second season, they're talking about what a failure he was and what a colossal mistake it was for the Buffalo Bills to have drafted him. And now, he's probably going to win the MVP this year.
The we were talking about, I believe, is confidence, and a number of people on this podcast has talked about how to build that, and that is through creating evidence for yourself.
Yep. That's
you can't just shout affirmations in the mirror. You have to create evidence for yourself. And what I hear you saying, Adam, is that I think you have to regularly put yourself in the position to do something hard, do something challenging. And it almost doesn't matter what that thing is, because regardless, if you prove to yourself, it sounds like the science is backing this up. If you prove to yourself that you can do hard things, that is portable to other areas of your life. I did the improv class so I can go do the triathlon. And one of them's mental, one of them's physical, but both are hard. And so I'm thinking of, can you maybe go a little deeper on why this is so effective to regularly, the Navy SEALs would say, push your edges, why it's so useful to regularly be banging on those edges of your current zone of comfort and competency, because it's portable to other areas of your life.
Yeah. I mean, what you said is sort of, what was the phrase you used? I really liked it, about evidence to yourself. Is that what you said?
I think confidence needs evidence. This comes from other guests, so I'm paraphrasing,
no, I like that
but
phrase.
Confidence needs evidence that you've done hard things, but it doesn't have to be the exact thing. You can say, well, I've done this hard thing, so now I'm going to go do this other completely different, but still hard thing.
Yeah, there's a I do this task in my class where I get people 8 candidates for a kidney, and I randomly assign them to advocate for why one of the candidates should receive it. And one of the things that we show in this research is that whoever they advocate for all of a sudden shoots up the list, right, in their mind. And it's not strategic. It's not like I'm going to do this so I can benefit. It's like they feel more attached to that person. But part of it is that when they think about how to persuade others, they're actually persuading themselves, because they're coming up with evidence that's going to work. And in some ways, what they're doing is they're coming up with the evidence that also works for them. And I think it's the same thing with experience, right? Is that we can use, in some ways, we're always, psychologists like to use these words sometimes, but like we're always both the object and the subject of our own attention, right? In some ways we're observing ourselves doing the things that we're doing. I'll give you one example that's not it's kind of in the domain of leadership. So one of the things I've talked a lot about is how all the principles of leadership can apply to being a better and more inspiring and more effective parent. And one of the things that when I have two kids now, 7 and 8, but when they were toddlers, I found myself doing the exact same thing my father did, which is get so mad at my kids when they were having their tantrums and blah, blah, blah. And then I realized really quickly that when I exploded, um, it was like they exploded. Like it was the worst possible thing I could do.
You set the
Originally you
tone,
think,
man.
yeah,
You're
you're
the
like,
leader.
if I use more force, I'll overcome their force. But all I did was create, either, terror or more force, and so, I basically said, okay, and this is a good example. One of the things I talk about in the book is about it's good to think about the inspiring characteristics of leaders in our lives, but also the infuriating characteristics of the leaders in our lives. And so my dad is one of my heroes. He inspires me in so many ways. His fury and his anger, like even penetrated my nightmares as a kid, right? And that was like his one big flaw. And so I was like, okay, I'm not going to be like my dad. And what I found myself is every time that I was able to stay calm, even when they were having tantrums, I felt such a level of pride in that accomplishment. And afterwards, I would reflect on it and be like, "You did it. Okay, next time you're going to be able to do it again." Right? And it's exactly that idea of the evidence. And so, like, I see them having a tantrum, and I'm like, "I know what I'm doing. I know exactly what I have to do here. I have to stay calm. That's the number one goal that I have here. And then if I do stay calm, I feel really good about myself." Now, we want to do better the next time, but we also, if we fail occasionally, we also don't want to feel shame. And we can come back to that later, but I've studied the concept of shame and why shame tends to be a particularly destructive emotion, whereas guilt is a more constructive emotion. And I know people say, oh, he feels shame and shame
Shame
and
and guilt.
guilt. Yeah, yeah. And but they are two separate things, and they have, really important different consequences.
I did want to hit back one more
Yep.
piece of the Tammy Joe
Yeah,
story.
yeah.
Okay, the pilot. She did something actually before the flight that I
Yeah,
think
yeah.
helped prepare them for the adverse situation they found themselves in, which it's not always just about reacting in the moment or responding in the moment. It's about what you do leading up to the moments. Can you share more about how she kind of collectively
Yeah.
found some commonalities among her crew and the people she was working with that helped?
Yeah. So one of the most fascinating things, by the way, the first thing I ever did in my research career was the professor that I worked with as a research assistant in 1992, if you can imagine how long ago that was. He had this incredible grant from NASA to study cockpit crews and looking at this isn't even in the book, but it's like he studied, about when they make errors and everything. And he found this and I used to open all of my lectures around this example, which is that, think of like a 20-hour flight, from, here to Singapore was 19 hours, or, like LA to Australia, right? Chicago to, Buenos Aires. Like, when is the cockpit crew more likely to have an error at the beginning of the flight or the end of the flight? And everyone's like, oh, the end of the flight, because they're tired or they're bored or they're complacent. But it turns out there's more errors at the beginning of the flight. And there's a reason why, is that in most cockpit crews, they have never met each other before. So they have no idea how to work together. And it's only over time, over the course of them being inside this cockpit, that they start to coordinate their behavior effectively. And so that was also the case with Tammy Jo Schultz. She had never met the flight attendants before. And I'm not even sure if she'd ever met her co-pilot before. She might not have. And it was fortunate. It was luck. They had about 20 minutes of extra time before the plane boarded. And so she just chatted with them and started talking. And one of the ways that she started the process is she shared a little bit about herself. Right? She could ask people questions, tell me about yourself, but that's also a little awkward. And she said, hey, just want to get to know you all a little better. Here's something I'm going through right now. I have a child that's about to graduate from high school, and I'm trying to pick a good gift for them. And then her first officer says, my kid's graduating from high school too. I've been thinking about the same thing. And then someone mentioned, I just got this great gift. I'm, in this Bible group, and we're doing a study on Psalms. And then Tammy Jo's like, I'm doing a study on Psalms. And then they start talking about like what's their favorite passages in the Bible, and and so they start having this conversation, and they get to know each other better. There's this old company, and I don't even know if their song exists. I used to teach this 20 years ago, Ingersoll Rand, and there's this great video about how they used to take them like 18 months to do no hand grinder. And a client said, you got 6 months to get us like a better hand grinder than you currently have.
To do
And
what? I'm sorry.
oh, a hand grinder, like to grind, like a machine that grinds things down. I
Oh,
don't know exactly. The details aren't that important, but
okay. Sorry.
some type, no, some type of tool. So that they made tools, and they needed to update their tool to be a better tool. And usually it would take them like 2 years to do prototype and everything. And a client gave them 6 months. And the CEO says the single most important thing, the transformative leadership thing that I did that changed everything and made all this possible was we had a pre-project barbecue at my house. And again, like Tammy Jo Scholl's talking to her people, and she's like, you know, I got to meet people, and know their first names, and they got to relax, and they got to come to my house, and they got to, see me in a natural environment. Now, there's a couple other things, related to leadership that they did, is that they actually put them all the people working on it together. So they took marketing out of marketing and put them here. They even involved people from the factory floor and moved, so they created a real team, a diverse team, but made them cohesive by co-locating them. But like this idea that we forget that we are social human beings that want to connect with others. And sometimes what's going to help you in a crisis is, did you have a coffee with that person before? Did you go to their house for a barbecue? Did you talk about something deeper than the weather before your flight took off?
Isn't it weird, man? Like at the end of the day, if we show that we care and have love for one another, regardless of what the task is, the odds are better that we're going to do a better job if that exists. And some people I feel like think that's the soft stuff. I get made fun of for this at times when I bring this up when I'm working with leadership teams about how have you shown that you care for each other? How have you shown that you have love for each other?
Yeah.
What have you done specifically to build those genuine relationships out of curiosity, out of a desire to know one another versus just saying, look, this is the problem, do it.
Yeah.
And at times they're like, dude, we need to skip over it. We don't have time for that. We just need to get to it. And I'm like, this is it. Like, this is it. You can't skip the stuff because you think it's soft. It's the real stuff. It's the human element of solving problems, of trying to do something big that's really hard. If you're doing it with other people, which you almost always are, I don't think you can skip this stuff. I don't think you skip the barbecue, right? Some people would say, that's for the soft people. I don't know, man. Like, I love that the science and the research backs this up.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, team building is a real thing. Now team building doesn't work if you uh, isolate all of that care into this one team building activity, and it doesn't then, infiltrate the rest of your interactions. But
you have
this
to
idea,
genuinely care.
Yeah.
Genuinely, not just looking for some outcome. I think that's also part of maybe what happens is you get a transactional style leader who reads Inspire or they listen to this podcast and say, oh, they tell their admin assistant, hey, book a barbecue. I'll show up. I'll be there for it. So I can kind of transactionally show that I care for my team. And then they just go on to the next thing. Like, it does have to come from a genuine place, because we've probably all had a boss at times, if you worked in corporate America, who that it's been, I know I have the thought bubble right in my head of this specific person, of the transactional, like check the box person, as opposed to the transformational leader who genuinely does care and wants to do it the right way. And usually over the long term, that person who genuinely cares, their outcomes are far better than the transactional one.
Absolutely. And it's a long-term investment, right?
Yes.
And so you might not even see that, that positive effect until, years later, right? But, there's two things that I've always talked about when I teach about, leadership and about investment in other people. Is there's a term in economics called Pareto optimality. And Pareto optimality is like, there is no other better approach to a problem than the one you're taking, right? If you did anything else differently, you would be worse off. And investing and in other people is the Pareto optimal solution because it is morally the right thing to do, right? To be kind to other people, to invest in them, help them to grow, elevate people. It's also in your long-term best interest for doing so, right?
Long
And
term.
so, yeah, long-term, right? And that's what, the heart of inspire. So I have in my research, what I do is I basically ask thousands of people across the globe a very simple question. I just say, tell me about a leader that inspired you. And I say, I want you to be a scientist and I want you to pinpoint what was it about that person that inspired you, right? And people say, and I ask them to describe what is that feeling of being inspired like? And people use words like, warmth and light and energy, or like someone used a phrase that I still use today, which is a wellspring of hope and possibility, right? Which I just think really just capture that. But I also asked them about another leader in their life. And I've already sort of mentioned this person. It's like, tell me about a leader that also changed you inside. And that's the key. Like leaders change us inside. But this time, instead of creating that wellspring of hope and possibility, they created a seething cauldron of rage and resentment, right? And one of the things that I found in my research is that, those inspired and infuriating leaders really exist on a continuum where they are mirror images of each other. So like just as one, inspiring leader is courageous and infuriating leader is cowardly, right? Inspiring leader sees the big picture. Infuriating leader is sort of lost in the weeds and pessimistic, right? Inspiring leader is sort of generous versus, infuriating leader is selfish. And, you know, sometimes being infuriating, aggressive, using coercion, leading by compliance, is actually in the short term very efficient, right? I want my kid to pick that thing up off the floor. I yell out enough, they're going to pick that thing up off the floor, right? And so we get immediately rewarded by being infuriating sometimes, right? But we start to create these sort of seeds of infuriation that then start to grow and fester, and churn into, resentment over time. And sometimes that resentment eventually explodes. And so we're kind of, Danny Kahneman, this very famous Nobel Prize winning, he won the Nobel Prize in economics, he's a psychologist. He had this great phrase about like, we are, rewarded for punishing and punished for rewarding, even though rewarding people is the far better long-term strategy. But immediately the punishment seems to be the better approach, right? And so we have to, like, in some ways, key part of the book, one of the three universal factors that really separate the inspiring for a leader is this concept called visionary and seeing the big picture. And part of what we have to do as a leader, the big picture really is, what's going to lead to the best long-term outcome.
So I like this kind of great boss, bad boss exercise. I've done something similar where best favorite boss, best boss, worst boss. All right, let's list it out. List
Yep.
their qualities, right? So a few of them that you mentioned, the best ones, right? Inspiring ones, they're courageous, they're optimistic, they're generous. The worst ones are cowardly, pessimistic, selfish.
Yep.
I feel like we all know that.
Yep.
Yet we've probably all done chapters of our lives in the wrong column. Hopefully not long chapters, but we probably all have. So we know this, I think, kind of intuitively.
Yep.
And you go deeper to help. Yet if we know this, why do we how do we go more from understanding it to then putting it into play to be the inspiring leader, the inspiring
Yep.
boss for our teams, to be more courageous and optimistic and generous as opposed to being cowardly, pessimistic, and selfish?
Yeah. Two things I'll say about the first is that, the name of the book, right, is Inspire, and the subheading is the universal path for leading yourself and others. And I use the word path very deliberately, right? Which is like, in some ways, there's this path between the inspiring and infuriating person, and you can walk in this direction and walk in this direction. But the second thing I think is really important, if you look at this path right now, it's like flat, right? But what does life do to us? Life tilts it towards the infuriating end of the spectrum. And if you look to see, I do another exercise, people, I
It
say,
tilts it. Hold on. I'm sorry for interrupting. It tilts it. What do you mean?
I, so like, here's a good example. So if I
Okay.
ask people, think about a time when you were infuriating. What were some of the precipitating variables or factors? What was the contextual things that led you to be more infuriating? And first thing that almost everyone brings up was I was exhausted. I was
Yep.
tired. Another one, I like to show the Snickers commercial. Joe Pesci goes crazy, right? It's supposed to be a
Funny.
college kid, but it's Joe Pesci screaming, yelling at people because he's hungry, right? Or, when we get anxious in a high stakes situation, or we're in a news situation, or we got angry at our spouse and then we take it out at someone at the office, or people are more infuriating when they're in novel situations that they've never been in before, right? When people are yelling at us, right? We start to yell at others. And so that's what I mean by tilting it, is that
Got you.
like life pushes us towards the infuriating end of the spectrum. So we need to have ways to tilt it back, right? And even to tilt it this way. And I think one of the things that, you mentioned evidence, which I think is a really important thing, and we can use that evidence. But another is, and a lot of psychologists have talked about this, is, one of the single best things we can do for ourselves is build in habits, right, that make us more inspiring. And a good example is um, like I floss my teeth every night. I have a ritual. I floss my teeth, then I brush my teeth, then I use mouthwash, and then I put in my retainer from when I had braces. And you know my wife does not floss as much as she should, and she's been told the dentist you're at risk of developing cavities, and I just keep telling her, just build it in as a habit. Like anytime you want to brush your teeth, floss, make yourself floss first. And then eventually, if you don't floss, you're going to feel naked. It's kind of like, the old days where people used to put on the seatbelts and be like, oh my God, I feel like I'm being trapped. And then if they get used to it, they don't put on the seatbelt. They're like, oh my God, I'm about to fly out the window, right? That's the changing of a habit. And so one of, I think, the important things is develop habits. I'll tell you two things about that. So I was delivering a lecture once about this, and I always give people this call to action, and I call it the leader amplification ship effect call to action. I can tell you more about that in a second. But essentially, I just ask leaders, I say, pick 3 people who have less power than you in an organization and send them an email praising them for something they did really well recently, or thanking them for their contribution in some way. And I say, be specific. So it's genuine, right? Because it's infuriating when it's not authentic. And I did this once with a group of CEOs, right? 50 CEOs in the room. At 10:15, we're taking a break at 10:30. 10:28, one of the CEOs raises his hand and says, I already sent all my 3 emails. I've already got 3 emails back. They were like, oh my God, I'm so, thank you so much. One of them, it was a Friday, one of them wrote, I'm finally going to take my spouse to that restaurant, the new restaurant they always wanted to go to. And I like this story for 2 reasons. One is I've done research and I've shown that, remember I talked about how does power affect people? Power basically frees the reins and makes us impulsive. So power actually kind of shifts us towards the inferiority end of the spectrum because we don't pay as much attention to other people. And, so this guy could have waited to the break rather than not listening to me. But instead of listening to me, he immediately did this thing. But it also didn't take him almost any time at all. And so I was telling this story once, and a president of a bank, Joseph Stigliano, he's got 1,400 employees. I think it's 1,200 or 1,400. I can't remember the exact number, but somewhere in that range. I know it's over 1,000. And he said, oh, yeah, I built this into a daily habit. And I was like, tell me more. He says, every morning over my cup of coffee, I send an email to every one of my employees who has a birthday that day. And it takes me about 10 minutes. And I was like, wait, let's calculate. So he's like, that's like 5 emails a day, every day of the year. He said, yep. And then he forwarded me. He said, well, I'll show you one of my emails. So he said, hey, let's say to you, hey, Ryan, happy birthday. How did bowling and track go last week? That's it. It's one sentence. And then he showed me the response that came back from the person. It was like a novel. Oh, let me tell you all about bowling. I did this. I did the split, blah, blah. I don't even know if you've read the email, right? But they were so excited to be wished happy birthday by the president of the bank, but he knew something about that person. He knew they liked bowling, and so obviously it requires some setup, but he built that as a daily habit, and he's like, I can't drink my coffee without doing it now. It's just I'd be like, what am I doing with this coffee without sending my emails? And so, how do we send that daily habit? Now, I was telling this in another time, and a CEO said, actually, I do that. And I said, well, tell me more what you do. And he says, every single day over coffee, I do the same thing. I just pick one person and I try to elevate them in some way. And he said something at the end that really, really resonated with me. And this gets back to Pareto optimality. He says, you know what? My email would say, hey, Ryan, that podcast you did last week, you hit it out of the park. I loved it. He said, I just put a skip in their step. But
Yep.
he says, Ryan's going to send me back an email. And Ryan's going to be, oh my God, thank you so much, Adam. Like that means so much to me. That's going to put a skip in my step. So by sending out this praise, like I'm actually elevating myself because like I get so much joy from their responses. He said, and this was really changed me because people say face-to-face communication, always communicate in thing. And he had this great response. He said, look, if I praise Ryan to his face, Ryan would kind of feel a little embarrassed. He'd be like, "Oh, thanks, man." And then it's kind of awkward. Like, do we hug now? Like, what happens? But if I do it over email, two things are beneficial. One is Ryan gets to savor it. Ryan can go back and read it. Ryan can send it to his best friend, significant other, his parents, right? But I get that email back, right? And I'm going to get a much more positive response if I do it to Ryan in over email. Like the other day, I got a text from a student who just accepted a job at Harvard. So she just got a job at Harvard, and I've been working with her for 5 years, and she just wrote this incredibly nice text to me that was like, I couldn't have done it without you. And I was with a postdoc who just got a job at University of Pennsylvania, another job. And he was like, he's like, I just want to say, like, I feel the same way. And also I'm like, oh, what are you talking? Like, I just felt so awkward hearing it in person, but like by getting my text, I was so like, overjoyed by it. So I think, but again, those are two examples. Joseph Stigliano, right? This president of this bank, and he gave me, approval to use his name. I don't have the approval from the CEO that I mentioned earlier to use his name in the story, but both of them, exact same thing. They're doing something over their coughing that elevates someone in their orbit. But by doing that, they also get elevated themselves.
Well, it also changes their default setting to be looking for moments of greatness. I have a few friends who do
Yeah.
this really well. Brooke Cups does this with his basketball team, where after practice and games, they have a set of core values, and the team goes into the meeting and they say, call it moments of greatness, where each player has to recognize moments of greatness for others.
Yeah.
And so they know that they're going to be asked this question. So they're always looking for their teammates living up to their core values. Another friend of mine named Rob Kimball, who runs a company he's a CEO and owner of 800 plus people. Their executive team meets once a week, and they open each meeting with every member of the exec team writing a thank you note to somebody at the company who lives up to their company core values.
Yeah.
And so that's happening 52 times a year, where those people, roughly 12 people a week, are getting a thank you note. And it almost shifts the default setting for each of those members of the executive team to be on the lookout for people doing great things. So they're always looking because they know they're writing this note on Tuesdays. And so it just almost changes the way you view the world. Instead of being pessimistic or looking for people doing bad things, not that doesn't happen, because you do have to correct things that aren't good, but they're looking for people doing it great, for living up to their values. And I think that makes them a more inspiring leader. That makes them on the end of the spectrum where you want to be, versus the one who's upset all the time or pessimistic or looking for people who are doing it wrong.
You're totally right. And I think, um, I think there's a lot to be learned from leadership in sports teams because, it's high performing, right? And it's complex. There's lots of team dynamics going on. And, that's where you really learn what it means to be a leader. We have the Columbia football coach who recently retired from health reasons. But when he came in, Columbia hadn't won a game in over 2 seasons. Is one of the longest losing streaks in the history of Columbia. And this is when I was here. I arrived in Columbia in 2012. And Coach Bagnoli came in. He'd been one of the winningest coaches. He had retired, but then he was brought out of retirement to do this. Their first year, they won 3 games. And then second year, they won 7. And then he retired just last year, but the coach that took over, they were the first time in their history tied for the Ivy League championship, or first time in 60 years, I think it is, something just incredible. And he did lots of different things to transform the team. But he says something to me that I still remember to this day, which is he says, here's the single biggest decision that I have to make as a leader each year is who can I yell at? Because sometimes people mess up. And you got to say that wasn't the right thing. And, we need this habit instead of that habit. We got to go this way instead of that way. And sometimes you got to do it strongly. You got to do it forcefully. And if I pick the wrong player and that person crumbles, whole team turns against me. I pick the right person, whole team gets on board. And so he said, and so I don't know if you saw, but at the beginning of the year, Steve Kerr for the Golden State Warriors preached from training camp day one, fewer turnovers, fewer turnovers, fewer turnovers. We cannot win. We can't do what we did when we were the most talented team and we could throw crazy passes behind our back and throw them into the stands. That's okay because we're gonna, we're better than they are, And it was like the fourth or fifth game of the year, and Steph Curry threw some crazy pass from one end of the court to the other. It got stolen, and they got an easy three-pointer like 3 seconds later. And Steve Kerr called a timeout and just lit into Steph Curry. And just was like, obviously became a huge topic of conversation, afterwards. And he's like, look, we have a value. We've preached that value from day one, and our most important player violated that value. And I had to let him know that he can't do that. But I also knew that he could handle it. Right. And like everyone commented, like Steph Curry didn't get upset. He didn't pout. He didn't act. He's like, you're right. I shouldn't throw that pass, and I'll do better next time.
I think that's high levels of emotional intelligence. I remember my offensive coordinator, Ron Ollery, pulling me aside after my junior year, going into my senior year. We had a very talented team. And he said, look, this is one-on-one. And I will never forget it. He said, look, the guys need to see me publicly ripping you. They need to see it, because if they see me ripping you, the guy I was scholarship type of guy, all this stuff, if they see me doing it to you in public, they know I can do it to anybody. And so just so you know, I'm going to do that. And I need to do that for the betterment of this team. I want to make sure you're aware, you're on board. It's not fake. It's going to be real. I'm not going to do it just to do it. I'm going to do it when you make a mistake, but I'm going to rip you in front of your peers, in front of your guys. So they know if I can do it to him, I can do it to anybody. And I never forgotten that one-on-one. It was like 10-minute conversation before it happened. And he definitely did it regularly. And I felt like he kind of brought me in. Like I felt like we had this deeper relationship of trust. And I was like, not that I was like in on this little tool, because I definitely felt bad when he was ripping me because I messed up or threw a pick or did something stupid. But it was like, as a leader, I just thought that was such a smart move, such an astute thing for somebody to bring me in. And I think it helped our team in general, because then he would rip other guys too. And they knew, well, hey, everybody gets this. Like, that's just the way, that's the way it is on this team. And that's how our coach operates.
Yeah, I think, I'm going to come back to a word I've used already once, and I've called it one of the three core universal factors. And we can talk about the other two, which we've brought up in, not explicitly, is, he shared with you his vision, right?
Yes.
And so that's part of what it is. I'm going to share with you a story right now that I've never shared before on a podcast or anywhere before, but it's a good example of how the effect when you don't share the vision, but also about picking the right person. So when I came up, so when you're at a university, about in your 6th year, usually you come up for what's called tenure. And if you get tenure, you have a lifetime appointment for like the next 30 years. That is guaranteed income. That is, your life is about as good as you can be of any job in the world, right? And I was coming up for my mid-tenure review at Northwestern University, but I had been at another university before. So I was in my 6th year post-PhD. So in some ways, it would have been the normal time that I might have come up for tenure if I just started right at Northwestern. And my department, voted enthusiastically to recommend me for tenure. And when you come for tenure, your packet and your research gets sent out to about 10 to 15 people out in the world who evaluate it and make a recommendation. And I got emails from multiple of these people saying, hey, I got your packet for your mid-tenure review, but I said, you should totally tenure this person. He deserves tenure. So I go into my meeting with the deans where I'm thinking I'm getting tenure. My departments told me they want me to get tenure. Outside people told me I want to get tenure. I didn't get tenure. I got promoted to untenured associate, but not to a tenured position. And it was unbelievably shocking. And I asked for explanations and I was getting poor, like inconsistent responses back. Anyway, so I leave the dean's office. I go in the stairwell and I cry. Probably cry for about 10, 15 minutes. I mean, I was so shocked and overwhelmed. I go upstairs. My department has a cake for me, says, congratulations. And I just look at them in the eye and I'm like, it didn't happen. And I go into my office, close the door, and they, of course, run downstairs to the dean's office, like, what the, you know. But anyway, I went to go to I took the initiative. I went to go talk to the dean the next day. I said, hey, maybe can we talk a little bit more? And he said, absolutely, come on in. And he actually told me kind of like what happened with you. He said, look, this mid-tenure thing has been causing us so many problems because people come in and they're like, well, this person got early tenure. Why am I not getting early tenure? And he basically said, we kind of wanted to reset the bar. And you had one of the best records we've seen at that point. It was like, well, if we don't give Adam early tenure, then no one else is going to ask for it. Now, the difference is they didn't share that vision with me in advance, right?
Mm.
And explained it afterwards. Now, he also said something. He said, I took a calculated risk. Like I was like, of all the people that I've met, I figured you would, understand this, but also not be, go off half-cocked and like, and he was right. And I was like, yeah, I get it. I'm not happy about it, but like, and 3 years later, I got a full professor tenured offer from Harvard. And I said no, and I stayed at Northwestern, and so he was right. Like he had made a good calculation, pick the right person to yell at, or to not give, the greatest reward to. He's like, look, we have so much confidence in you. I think we know you're going to get tenure in 3 years. Like, like some people think you already deserve tenure. Like, and so, and I get it. It's like, yeah, it's like I love what I do. I'm not going to change my behavior. But I think the difference between what happened to you and what happened to me is you were given the vision, you were brought into the vision. Eventually I was, but it was after the fact, after I already had this emotional reaction. And I think it just comes back to something so fundamental and so essential that we said at the very beginning. What did Tammy Jo Schultz do? She didn't just fly the plane well. She told the passengers what she was doing. We're not going down, we're going to Philly, right? And that was like, without those 10 words, if this person had yelled at you, without telling you that they're going to do that and why they're going to do that, you would have had a very different reaction for it. And so I think, letting people in on your vision is critical. And one of the things I talk about, in the book is that sometimes we're really good at letting our second in command know our vision, but not the wider organization. Like people want to know why they're doing what they're doing.
Visionary is an interesting term. You hear like visionary integrator in this EOS system. I've had Gino Wickman on to talk all about that stuff with the book Traction. And I feel like this is a personal question, Adam, that I am like a plotter. I am a put my head down and do the next thing in front of me, and then the next thing. And one of my core values is consistency. And I do have the skill to consistently do the work every day. That's how this podcast has never missed a Sunday in a decade. I've never missed a Mindful Monday in that amount of time as well. Like no matter what, like sickness, travel, I can do that. But the visionary stuff of like thinking long term of like, what's happening with the learning leader in 5 to 10 years? What's your plan? I'm like, I don't know. I'm going to keep doing this. I'm going to keep following my curiosity and having smart people like Adam on the show and ask them questions and try to be a good listener and ask follow-up questions. What are like some of the tools or the ways for those of us who are the plotters, who are the consistent get to work every day type people who don't always pick their head up and look down the road 5 years? How can we become better visionaries? What can we do?
Yeah, I mean, I think the word visionary and the way that I define it in the book is like big picture, optimistic vision of the future that's simplified and visualized and repeated, right? And so really what it is it's just putting a context for your behavior, right? So here's one question that you might ask yourself: what it means to be visionary is like, why is consistency so important to you? Like consistency is the value, but what's the purpose of that value? Just in some ways, instead of saying thinking long term, I would say thinking broader, big picture, right? As a good example of like, um, um, I'll give you an example that we're experiencing right now in our own life is we've been very, very fortunate in my life. I have two young kids, 7 and 8. My mother-in-law, my wife's mother, came to the hospital when my son was born, and helped out and essentially never left. So she's lived with us for 8 years, and now she's leaving. She's going to go. She's moving out to Las Vegas, great new chapter in her life, and my older son is so attached to her. Like so, like we had two kids, essentially 14 months apart. So like, we really needed all hands on deck. And so like my wife was, taking care and breastfeeding the younger one. Lola and I were really taking care of the older one. So Lola is the Tagalog word for grandmother. My wife is Filipina, and born in the States, but Filipina. Anyway, so she's moving in next week. And about 3 weeks ago, my um, my son just started being really mean to his mom, to my wife. Just like, I don't want you to be near me, get away from me, blah, blah, blah. And this is a good example where the big picture really matters. He's mad that Lola's leaving. He can't express anger towards Lola. In fact, he and his grandmother have never fought, right? Like, she's his safety valve, right? And so he's angry. He can't express anger at this person. He's displacing that anger to my wife. And so, I keep saying you can't take it personally because, you got to see the big picture. What is going on here? Like you're a safe person that he can express this to. So rather than thinking he's being mean to me, thinking I'm I'm someone that he can be mad at, and so that he can deal with the loss that his grandmother's moving to their place. And so part of it, when I say visionary, it's just contextualizing, why is consistency matter important to you? Why do you do the podcast every single week? Well, what's the larger thing that you're trying to accomplish, which is you're trying to help everyone in this world be a better leader,
Mhm.
and if they're a better leader, they're going to make someone else's life better. And then that person's going to make someone else's life better. So the bigger picture is, by being consistent, it's not the long-term goal of actually maybe even seeing it. You're not going to see the number of people that have benefited. The broader goal is by being consistent and giving people the opportunity to learn, and that creates the potential for everyone to be better off.
Mm. I appreciate that. I, I like how you close the book, and I wanted to ask you about that. And that's the story about the Great Gatsby and your parents, specifically your dad.
Yeah.
Can you, and I know you gave this salutation speech at your high school graduation
Yeah.
about this as well. Can you talk more about your dad and the Great Gatsby and how that's impacted you?
Yeah, sure. So, my one of the I mentioned my dad and I mentioned his anger earlier, but one of the things that really connects me to my dad is he loved both fiction and movies. And so like we used to like watch movies and fiction and talk about like you know I remember we saw the movie Brazil when I was in high school, the Terry Gilliam film, and we just had these long, deep conversations about what the movie meant. Um, and so he really loved The Great Gatsby, and he loved The Last Page. And for those who don't remember, it's the main narrator thinking about Gatsby. He had this house, across the river from the woman that he always loved. And there is sort of a green light on the end of her dock. And so he's thinking about how every day Gatsby could look out at this green light and think about how close the thing that mattered most to him was, but also how the green light was a motivator and inspirer for him, like the thing that kept him going. And so there's a hopefulness to it, there's an optimism to it, and so my dad just loved this. And so in my I was salutatorium. I got to give a speech, and I sort of talked about the green light, in there. And I bring it up at the end of the book because I also talk about, the both the inspiring aspects, but also some of the infuriating aspects of my dad. But I end the book by saying this: is that here's the thing about my parents, that both my mom and my dad, that most inspired me, is they weren't perfect. But they try to be better today than they were yesterday, and they want to be better tomorrow than they were today. And there's just this level of just um, belief in self-improvement, the belief that, we could fall off the horse, but we could always get back on and try to find a better way to ride the horse tomorrow. And I think it's really, it's interesting. My wife lived in Japan for 2 years, and there's a term in Japan called kaizen, called continual improvement, right? This idea that we're always, improving. If you remember Glenn Ross, always be selling, that Werner's is, always be improving, right? Always, just all you can do in life is improve, right? And that's, you can't ask for anything more from anyone in the world. Is, all I want to do is try to be a little bit better podcaster today than when you're yesterday, a little bit better writer tomorrow than you were today. Like whatever it is that you're working on, just try to do a little better the next time.
So good, man. The book is called Inspire, the universal path for leading yourself and others. It's amazingly well written and crafted. Great stories, great science, really good practical application. You got it all. Adam, thank you so much for being here, man. I would love to continue our dialogue as we both progress, man.
I would love that too. Thank you so much for having me.
All right. Thanks, man.